procedures. Slightly different to policies. So procedures are how we implement a policy. Okay, policies, if you like, are the rules that we follow when we're in school, and procedures are how we actually put those into practice. Okay, so let's keep on the theme of safeguarding. If we think about a safeguarding policy, safeguarding procedures give us those step-by-step instructions in what to do. Okay, so maybe there's a flowchart procedure of, I've got a concern for a child, I need to write the concern down, or I need to make a report to my designated safeguarding lead, and then maybe an arrow telling you where that goes. Maybe there's a mass referral that happens, the decision making that happens within the local authority. So the procedures are that step-by-step guide for us to tell us how to implement the policy. Okay, just as a very quick and crude overview for you. Just should have included this on the PowerPoint, but I just want you to see here, hopefully you can see. We have legislation and law at the top. Now that legislation and law filters down into the statutory guidance. The statutory guidance is almost like a watered down version of that legislation and law, a much smaller document that sets out exactly what the legislation and law is telling us what to do. Then we have below statutory guidance policy. So the policy is informed by the statutory guidance, okay, that comes through. And then below that, we have procedures. So the step-by-step instructions on how to implement these policies. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay, right then. So on Moodle, on this unit tile that you'll find, you will be able to see a very handy worksheet that Kathy created for this criteria. Thank you, Kathy. You don't have to use it. It's a really useful thing to use. You can include it in a Word document if you wanted. It's essentially a table that you can go copy and paste, and you can plop that onto your Word document if you like. Now, in this worksheet, it lists for us various policies and procedures that relate to teaching and learning and pupil welfare and staff welfare. You label the policies specific to your school or setting, or the ones that you've researched, and then you give us a little bit of an explanation or an identification. Let's say, I get my command verbs right here, not to confuse anybody, just a couple of sentences to explain to us what each of those policies are. Okay, right. So let's start by looking at some policies and procedures that are relating specifically to staff, because this criteria 5.1 asks us to break down our policies and procedures into different categories. And the first one we're going to look at now is staff. So some of these will be available within your school settings. I know that it's going to be difficult for some of you to get hold of all of the policies and procedures. If any of you are finding that tricky and you can't find policies and procedures that relate to a particular category, please let us know, because we will gladly give you some of our college ones if you can't find yours on a public domain anywhere. So, policies and procedures relating to staff. We've got an appraisal and performance policy. Okay, so that's like the regular supervisions, the check-ins that you have with your line manager. Pay policy, so maybe a policy on pay scales that we have, so or different bandings within your school based on your role. Safeguarding and safer recruitment policy, you'll all be familiar with this now. Safer recruitment policy will also set out procedures that we need to carry out when we're interviewing and when recruiting for somebody. Confidentiality policy, so again, another term that you'll be familiar with doing your safeguarding unit, but this is also about how we share information when we're making referrals ourselves as members of staff and working with multi-agencies. Grievance policy, okay, so if you have any complaints or any issues within your school, a clear policy that details where you need to take those concerns. Whistleblowing policy, again, a term that you'll be familiar with that safeguarding unit, but where you go to and what you do when you've got concerns about a member of staff. Data protection policy, GDPR, I'm sure that's a term that you will be familiar with now, but data protection policy will set out how we store information on children and how we share that information with others. Complaints and disciplinary policy. Okay, so this usually within a disciplinary policy for staff will set out stages of disciplinary, gross misconduct, and give us some example of what constitutes disciplinary action. Okay, So let's look at some policies now on pupil welfare. Safeguarding and child protection policy, we're all familiar with those type of policies now, I am sure. Online safety policy, when we come to our IT unit, we're going to look at this one in a little bit more detail, but this will include in what ways we give children access to the internet whilst they're with us within their school, and how we use online learning platforms for our learners too. Health and safety policy, so this will include things within the indoor learning environment, the outdoor learning environment. It will include equipment, trips, off-site visits. Mobile phone and social media policy, separate to the online safety policy. It will also include, even though we're talking about pupil welfare, the use of mobile phones and social media by members of staff, so including on your social media profile, for example, where you work. Supporting children with medical conditions and maybe the physical care needs that results within. Anti-bullying policy, which again usually sets out examples of what constitutes bullying in that school and the stages or disciplinary action that happens on the back of an incident of bullying being found within a school premise. Drugs awareness policy, so education that happens with drug awareness with children, any action that's taken on the back of any issues that present within this area. PSHE policy, now this can also include things like Thrive, Intervention, SEAL. Lots of schools will have very different ways of how they support and uphold PSHE policies, and it will be quite specific to each individual school, and that would be set out within that policy. And behaviour policy. Now again, we have statutory guidance around behaviour management and how to encourage positive behaviour and how to manage challenging behaviour, and we'll come on again in a little bit more detail into that when we go on to our behaviour management unit. But behaviour policy will set out again examples for parents, for children of challenging behaviour, or it might have a zero tolerance excerpt in there for us to look at, but it also put in there quite clearly how behaviour is managed, what the expectations are and what the interventions will be, how children are supported, and maybe what outside agencies will be used to manage behaviour as well. A policy I find that gets reviewed very often within schools. Okay, so some examples of policies now around teaching and learning. There may well be a teaching and learning policy. Okay, so it will set out information about the various curriculums that are followed in the key stages. It may talk about other influences on curriculum. Maybe there's a forest school provision that exists there. Maybe there's a nurture group provision that exists within the school. Or there may be a particular unit, if we have a unit for children who have autism, for example, or we may have a hearing impairment unit within the school. Teaching and learning policy should set out information about how that provision supports and upholds the various curriculums. There will be an early years policy in place because every reception class will be following the early years foundation stage curriculum as opposed to the national curriculum. There'll be a SEND policy in there, so a special educational needs and disabilities policy. Now that will talk about things like the local offer. It will talk about the education and healthcare plans. It will also talk about the special educational needs coordinator and how outside intervention and multi-agencies are used to support delivery and intervention for specific children. There'll be a homework policy that's in there, so the expectations that are set by the school and the support that's available, whether online learning platforms are used. A marking policy will be on there, which will discuss how work's marked, again, what the expectations are of teachers and how that marking is communicated, how the data and information from the marking is tracked to track children's attainment and progress. Curriculum policies for different areas. So especially when we're thinking about secondary provision, we need to think about the various curriculum expansion or the GCSE offer, for example. Enrichment policy, so after school clubs, lunchtime clubs, off-site visits, theatre trips, plays and shows and sports days and all these other things that we do for enrichment will be detailed within an enrichment policy. Okay. And lastly, policies and procedures that relate to equality, diversity and inclusion. Now, you will find it a rare occurrence when you look at a policy that doesn't capture somewhere information relating back to equality, diversity and inclusion. But we are still obliged to have very specific policies in place that set it out. So an inclusion policy, now this will talk about not just special educational needs and disabilities, it will talk about our vulnerable cohort of learners, it will talk about community outreach work, it will talk about engaging with parents and carers. Equal opportunities policy, again, we'll do those things too and set out maybe how we're providing support to various groups of people, not just the students, but their parents, their families as well. Our SEND policy, again, that will detail very specifically the intervention and support that is in place in relation to special educational needs and disabilities, and also specific members of staff that hold individual roles and responsibilities in relation to SEND. Disability and access policy, now you may find that exists within your SEND policy or maybe in your equal opportunities policy, but we need to talk about not only just physical access, but access to the curriculum, access to learning, access to the mainstream provision, or maybe we're not looking at mainstream here, maybe we're looking at a specialist school, for example, Mayfield or Combe Pafford. They will still have disability and access policy there, just to make sure that they have covered the diverse range of special educational needs and disabilities that they support. There'll be an accessibility plan, so that will be open to review and it will be kept as generic as possible, but it will have some specific examples in there of how we make sure as a school or an educational setting that we remain accessible to all children and their families. So again, it's not just talking about ramps in and out of the building or large doorways enough to fit wheelchairs through, or maybe having members of staff who can sign fluently. It's also going to be about how we are accessible to maybe a deprived community, or how we make sure that our homework policy is accessible to all, or how we encourage and foster positive parent-carer relationships so that we're able to have a free flow of communication in order to support children. It's accessibility to everything. Gifted and talented pupils policy can be called lots of different things in a school, but in the same way that we support children that we have concerns about and we feel that they're are going to be at a disadvantage or maybe fall behind on those expected ages and stages of development and learning without support, we also need to recognise that we need to support those children who have the ability to be stretched, to be challenged further, and to really thrive and flourish further than their expected age and stage of development. So we'll have a gifted and talented pupils policy, which again can be called lots of other things, set out to explain exactly how a school is going to support and deliver. The important thing to remember with any policy and procedure is that it's open to change. It's not set in stone. They are reviewed, they are amended all the time. For those of you who are getting emails come through, maybe on a school email account, you'll be aware of this, particularly at this moment in time, that policies are being updated to reflect the needs of the current cohort. A policy cannot remain unchanged for very long. It needs to reflect the current and specific needs, the most updated statutory guidance, and the legislation that we have. I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to start a new video shortly because it looks like we've just disconnected from our remote server. We're having some Wi-Fi problems today here and across the college, and we'll be back on to talk about 5.2 shortly. Thanks.